I met a guy named Matt through friends, and we dated on and off for a few years. Then we decided to move in together, and it was kind of out of nowhere. We both worked from home, so we wanted a place with a bit of space. We found a 2-bedroom apartment in an older building across town from my old place. It wasn't fancy, but it had hardwood floors, high ceilings, and a separate storage unit in the basement. We split rent and utilities evenly, and combined our bank accounts for groceries and bills. All in all, it felt like I'd started settling into what felt like a normal adult life. We unpacked everything ourselves, and I remembered clearly how much we had. He had a few boxes of clothes and some kitchen stuff. I brought most of the furniture, and a lot of the shared stuff like dishes and towels. Everything fit fine in the apartment. The only thing in the basement storage was some extra chairs and holiday decorations. About 6 months after we moved in, Matt went out of town for the weekend to visit his brother in Denver. We'd done that kind of thing before, taking solo trips to visit friends or family, so it didn't feel unusual. I spent Saturday cleaning and catching up on laundry. At around noon, I checked the mail and found a bill addressed to Matt. It was from a storage facility about 25 minutes outside the city. At first I thought it might be a mistake. We already had our unit in the building, and Matt never mentioned keeping anything elsewhere. Still, I read the bill, and it showed an ongoing monthly charge for a unit that had been active for over 3 years. I tried to think of a reason for it. Maybe it was something he forgot to cancel, or maybe it was his parents' stuff and he was just covering the cost. I didn't want to make assumptions, but it didn't sit right with me. We talked about money and even joined finances, so something like this should have come up. I texted him to ask what the charge was, but he didn't answer right away, which was unusual. I waited a couple of hours and still didn't hear back. At around 4 p.m., I grabbed my keys, got in the car, and drove out to the address listed on the bill. It was a plain row of units behind a chain-link fence, and the place looked like every other storage facility. I went into the office and told the guy behind the counter I was checking in on a unit my boyfriend rented. I gave him the name and address, and he handed me a clipboard to sign, like it was no big deal. I honestly thought it would be harder to get in. He buzzed open the gate and pointed me to Unit 104. It was in the middle of the row, with a standard roll-up door. I unlocked it and pulled it open. There were shelves along the sides, and everything was neatly arranged in rows of boxes. Each box was labeled by name and date. There were maybe 30 of them. I looked at the first one, and the label said, Erica 2014. I opened it, and it had a scarf, a journal, a pair of flats, some Polaroids, and a cheap paperback book with a note inside that said, Your favorite. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what I was looking at. I opened another box with a label that said, Melissa 2016. This one had a makeup bag, a hoodie, a framed photo of a couple at a cabin. The more I looked, the worse it got. There were toothbrushes and bottles of perfume in one of the boxes. Another had birthday cards, and even underwear. All of the items were sorted by name, and sealed in labeled plastic containers. Some of the boxes were more recent, and one box was marked, Tasha, 2021. That was the year Matt and I started dating. There was no sign of anything violent or illegal. It wasn't like that. It just felt obsessive, like he couldn't let go of anyone, or didn't want to. I started feeling sick. It wasn't just that he'd kept these things. It was the way he'd stored them away like artifacts. I tried to find a box with my name, but I didn't see one. I didn't take anything, then I locked the unit and drove home. I still hadn't heard back from him, but he texted me later that night. Hey, sorry. Phone died. Long day. Everything good. I didn't want to answer, so I sat with it until the next morning. I wasn't sure how to bring it up. I didn't want to yell or accuse him. I just wanted a straight answer. When he got home on Sunday night, I was waiting in the kitchen. He walked in smiling and kissed me on the cheek, but I didn't return it. I told him I found the bill, and I'd driven out to the unit. I told him exactly what I saw. He froze, then he sat down and said, I can explain. I said, go ahead. He told me he didn't keep those things out of obsession. He said it was about respect, that every relationship had been important to him in its own way, and he didn't want to throw those parts of his life away. He said he didn't go back to the unit often. He just liked knowing it was there. We talked for another hour, but nothing really changed. He offered to get rid of it all. He said he'd shut down the unit and never go back. I said that wasn't the point. I wasn't asking him to destroy anything. I just didn't want to be with someone who thought that hiding it was okay. I told him I'd be staying at my sister's place for a while. I packed a suitcase and left that night. A week later, I came back with my dad in a U-Haul and took the rest of my things. Matt wasn't home at the time. He texted a few times after that, but I didn't respond. I didn't block him, but I didn't see any point in staying connected. He was free to keep his museum. I just didn't want to be part of it. In the autumn of 2022, I was taking the train home after work. I was reading on my phone when a guy sat across from me and immediately tried to start a conversation. He was handsome and overly confident, the type of man I usually avoided. I didn't like the way he talked because he seemed too sure of himself. At one point, he made a rude comment about my glasses, which I assumed was an attempt to get a reaction. I told him he was being inappropriate and turned back to my phone. But later, when he asked me to take a walk with him after we reached our stop, I agreed, but I wasn't sure why. His name was Dan, and we only did a short walk around my neighborhood, but he seemed nice and we exchanged numbers. That evening, I overheard my parents talking about me in the other room. My mother said something about me being destined to be alone and never attract the right kind of man. My dad agreed without much thought. I stood in the hallway and listened. I didn't sleep well that night. Later that week, I saw Dan again, and I kissed him without much thinking. It wasn't planned. I think I just wanted to prove something to myself. We arranged to meet again the following afternoon, but he canceled at the last minute. Then he disappeared for a full week. I felt foolish for letting myself get swept up by someone like him, and I tried to put it behind me. But he called me eventually, and even though I was kind of upset, I said yes. He was charming in a way that made it hard to stay angry. That night, we talked for hours, and a few days later, we eloped. My father didn't speak to me for weeks after he found out. He made it clear that he didn't approve of Dan, and thought I was making a serious mistake. I didn't want to believe him. Things were fine for a while, but I soon realized Dan had barely any income. He was always a bit vague about work, and I knew he was self-employed, but he was making basically nothing. I asked about it, and he acted like it wasn't important. When the bills started to arrive, I pressed harder. That's when he admitted he'd been hoping to ask my father for help. I told him that wasn't an option. After several arguments, he agreed to take a job with his cousin Andy, who ran a real estate agency. For a short time, things felt stable, but Dan didn't change. One day, he sold a necklace that my grandmother had given me. I confronted him, and he denied everything until I showed him the receipt from the dealer, which I found in one of his pockets. One of Dan's old school friends came to stay with us around that time. He was pretty nice, and clearly thought the world of Dan. He said Dan was always a bit wild, but had a good heart. I wanted to believe him, but I kept finding signs that something was wrong. Dan stayed out late most nights, and he avoided questions, but I knew he was drinking a lot. One night, I ran into his cousin Andy on the street and found out that Dan had been fired from his job for stealing. When I confronted him, he told me it was all a misunderstanding, and he said Andy wouldn't press charges if he repaid the money. I asked how he planned to do that, but he didn't answer. That night, I wrote a letter saying I was leaving him, but I tore it up the next morning. I didn't know what I wanted. Then I got a call and found out that my father had died. I hadn't spoken to my dad since the wedding. I thought about calling him, but never did. I think part of me was waiting for him to reach out first. When I read the message, I didn't cry. I just felt numb. Dan didn't show much emotion either, aside from disappointment. He asked if I'd inherited anything, and I told him there was nothing much. A few days later, Dan mentioned a land development project. He said it was a rare opportunity, and asked if I thought my father might have left me some funds after all. When I told him no again, he looked frustrated and said he would try for a loan. I tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. He called our friend Greg and tried to convince him to back up the loan, and I told him that it was a bad idea. Dan overheard the conversation and was furious. That night he told me to stay out of his business and accused me of turning his friends against him. The next day, he said he was calling the whole thing off. Around the same time, I noticed he was spending time with my friend Claire. I didn't think much of it until she told me Dan asked her about poisons, specifically whether there were any that couldn't be traced after death. She thought he was just researching an idea for a story, since he did some creative writing for fun. One night, he brought me a glass of milk before bed. I took it from him but didn't drink it. I watched him leave the room and set it down on the bedside table. Then I stared at it for a long time. In the morning, I told him I needed to visit my mother for a few days, and he offered to drive me. I wanted to say no, but I didn't want to give him any reason to be suspicious. We left in his car that afternoon. The road wound along the edge of a cliff, and he was driving way too fast. My door wasn't shut properly, and it swung open on one of the turns. I grabbed for the handle, and he reached across me. I pulled away instinctively, then he stopped the car and turned off the engine. We sat in silence for a few seconds, and I was holding my breath without realizing it. He looked at me and asked if I thought he was trying to push me out. I just sat there in silence, looking down. He turned back towards the road and said he understood why I was afraid. We talked for a long time, and he eventually admitted that he tried to borrow money using my life insurance policy. He said it was a last resort and that it didn't work. He claimed he hadn't known what else to do. I asked why he hadn't told me sooner. He said he was ashamed and didn't think I would believe him. I didn't know what to believe anymore after all that, and I'd spent weeks doubting every word that came out of his mouth. But something about the way he said it made me pause. He looked exhausted and completely worn down. I sat there for a while without saying anything, then I told him I wanted to go home. I said we couldn't undo everything that happened, but we could stop making it worse. He asked why I still cared, and I told him I didn't know. Maybe I didn't want to admit I'd been wrong about everything. Maybe I still thought something could be salvaged. He didn't say anything for a long time, then turned the key and started the car. The drive back was quiet, and when we reached the house, I went upstairs and unpacked. He sat downstairs in the front room for most of the evening, and we didn't speak again until the next morning. Things didn't fix themselves overnight. He still had debts, and he still didn't have a job, but he started to tell the truth. It was humiliating for both of us, but I stood by him. I don't know if I made the right choice. I don't know what would have happened if I'd walked away. Maybe it would have been easier, but I stayed, and for the first time since we met, I stopped hoping he would become someone else, and started dealing with the person he actually was. I'd been dating my boyfriend Josh for about 4 months when we decided to move in together. It felt a little fast, but I had just ended a lease, and he insisted it would make sense for both of us. His place was clean and modern, and it already felt like home in some ways. He'd lived there alone for years, so it was fully set up with a big TV, new appliances, and decent furniture. However, there were at least 6 security cameras in his place. There was one in the hallway, one over the front door, one in the kitchen, and one in the living room. I noticed one in the guest room too. He said they were for safety, and since I was new to the area and a bit jumpy about break-ins, I didn't question it too much. The first few weeks were good. I was still working from home, while he left for the office most days. I'd see the little red lights blink on the cameras sometimes, but I got used to them. I figured they were only storing footage for a day or two, before getting overwritten. I didn't know anything about how those systems worked, just didn't seem like something I needed to worry about. Then one afternoon, I was trying to connect my laptop to the printer in the living room, and ended up clicking into the wrong folder on his desktop. It was labeled Clips. I opened it because I was curious. Inside were dozens of video files, all named with dates and times. Some were from weeks ago, and they weren't short clips either. They were hours long. I clicked on one, and realized it was footage from the bedroom. It was just me, alone, lying in bed scrolling on my phone. I went through a few more, and most of them were just normal things. One was of me cooking, me folding laundry or watching TV. But there were several files from the bedroom at night. I couldn't tell what made him save those in particular, but it felt invasive. I waited until he came home to ask him about it. He said he kept them for safety, in case anything ever happened while I was home alone. He said he was just being protective, and that he hadn't told me because he knew it might make me uncomfortable. I told him to delete the files, and he said he would. I didn't push harder than that, but the whole thing didn't sit right with me. I started turning the cameras to face the walls whenever I was home alone. A few days later, they were all turned back around. I didn't say anything, but I stopped feeling safe in that place after that. A week later, I got a message from my friend Kim. It was just a link with no explanation. I texted back asking what it was, and she said, "You need to see this. I'm sorry." I opened the link on my phone, and it led to some sketchy-looking site with dozens of grainy video thumbnails. One of them was me. I clicked it, thinking it couldn't actually be what it looked like, but it was. It was a recording of me asleep in bed. The angle was from the corner of the room, exactly where one of Josh's cameras was mounted. I backed out of the video immediately. There was a username on the page, and it matched one of the usernames I'd seen him use for email or logins. It wasn't even that anonymous. There were other videos on the page too. I recognized a few of them. Some were just of me reading in bed, another of me getting dressed, and there was one of me eating on the couch. They were all clearly recorded without my knowledge, and all were uploaded under his account. I called Kim, and she said she found the video through a link someone posted in a group chat she was in. She clicked it out of morbid curiosity and recognized me immediately. I thanked her and said I'd handle it. Josh came home about 20 minutes later, and I didn't try to hide what I'd seen. I just showed him the site and asked if he had anything to say. At first he said nothing, then he said it wasn't what it looked like. He claimed someone must have hacked into the system and uploaded the videos. I asked why the account matched his old email, and he said he didn't know. I asked why some of the videos had been edited, but he didn't answer. Eventually, he admitted to uploading some of them. He said he only did it a few times, and that he was curious about the kind of reaction they'd get. He said people posted all kinds of things online, and that I was overreacting. I asked him how long he'd been doing it, but he didn't give a straight answer. I asked him if there were other videos I hadn't seen, and he said no. I told him I wanted every copy deleted, and that I was leaving. Then he started getting defensive, saying I was making too big a deal out of something so harmless. I packed a bag and went to Kim's place that night. The next morning, I went to the police. I brought my phone with screenshots of the videos, the website link, and the folder I found on his computer. One of the officers said this kind of thing was more common than people realized. They opened a case, but warned me that sites like the one the videos were on often move around, and that the footage might have already been downloaded by others. They sent someone to the house that same day. Josh denied everything until they showed him the digital trail. I didn't go back to the place except once, with an officer, to get the rest of my things. Josh was taken in for questioning. I heard later that he was charged with voyeurism and distributing intimate images without consent. I never saw him again. I ended up staying with Kim for a few weeks. I was lucky to have someone who believed me and helped me through it. The worst part wasn't just that he did it, it was that he didn't seem to think it was wrong. He acted like I was overreacting, like I should have been flattered or something. That stuck with me more than anything. He knew me well enough to convince me to move in with him, to get me to trust him, and then he used that to do something disgusting,